Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second session of our webinar series, Dismantling Anti-Blackness in Education. I am Tambra Jackson, the Interim Dean for the School of Education at IUPUI, and I'm delighted to have you all present with us this evening. I'm looking forward to the conversation we get to have this evening with our panelists about racial violence against Black children in schools. As part of our mission, the School of Education is committed to examining our collective role in improving the human condition. And we do this with an explicit focus on social justice, inclusive of anti-racist and anti-oppressive perspectives and actions. Tonight's event is an opportunity for all of us to learn more about anti-Blackness in order to help inform our work and action for education equity. The specific focus on anti-Blackness for this series is intended to increase our understanding of what is at the root of why Black children lead many negative statistics in education and what we can all do to disrupt that narrative. As noted by Kiana Mariah Ross in her June 24th, 2020 op-ed in the New York Times, quote, "Racism fails to fully capture what Black people in this country are facing. The right term is anti-Blackness. To be clear, racism isn't a meaningless term, but it's a catch-all that can encapsulate anything from Black people being denied fair access to mortgage loans to Asian students being burdened with a model minority label. It's not specific. Many Americans awakened by watching footage of Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck are grappling with why we live in a world in which Black death loops in a tragic screenplay scored with the wails of childless mothers and the entitled indifference of our murderers. And an understanding of anti-Blackness is the only place to start. Anti-Blackness is one way some Black scholars have articulated what it means to be marked as Black in an anti-Black world. It's more than just racism against Black people. That oversimplifies and defangs it. It's a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize our humanity, the disdain, disregard, and disgust for our existence," end quote. During this evening, we will have an opportunity to hear from our phenomenal featured panelists and pose questions to move our thinking and actions forward about racial violence against Black children in schools. We encourage you to dialogue with each other in the chat. And if you have a specific question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. And now I'd like to pass the mic to our moderator for this evening, Dr. Jasmine Graham.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to moderate tonight's immeasurably and perpetually relevant discussion. The four individuals with us this evening will enlighten us around tonight's topic, racial violence against Black children in schools. Each speaker has prepared 10 minutes of remarks. Allow me to introduce them, starting with our first speaker for the evening, Dr. Nathaniel Bryan. Nathaniel Bryan, EDD, PhD, is an assistant professor of early childhood education at the Miami University. His teaching and scholarship explore issues of equity and diversity, critical race theory, culturally relevant teaching, urban education, and Black education. Though he studies broadly these frameworks, he is particularly interested in the constructed identities and pedagogical styles of Black male teachers and the schooling and childhood play experiences of Black boys in early childhood classrooms through a critical lens. Dr. Bryan has published in several peer-reviewed journals, including Contemporary Issues in Early Childhood Education, Journal of Early Childhood Teacher Education, Journal of Negro Education, Race, Ethnicity, and Education, Urban Education, and Urban Review. In his spare time, Dr. Bryan enjoys reading novels, traveling abroad, and spending time with his family. Dr. Dorothy Hines. Dr. Dorothy E. Hines holds a joint appointment as an assistant professor in African and African American Studies and an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching in the School of Education at the University of Kansas. She received a PhD in education philosophy from Michigan State University. Dr. Hines holds a master's degree in public administration from North Carolina Central University, graduating magna cum laude. Dr. Hines is a former high school U.S. history teacher, and she received a bachelor's degree in political science from North Carolina State University. Previously, Dr. Hines served as a teaching fellow with the Harvard Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. Her research explores the intersections of race, policy, and anti-Blackness in schools and in teacher education. Dr. Valerie Adams Bass. Dr. Valerie N. Adams Bass is a developmental psychologist, an assistant professor of youth and social innovation, and a faculty affiliate of the Youth Next Center to promote effective youth development in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on how Black children see themselves and related outcomes. Dr. Adams Best is most interested in examining how media exposure influences interpersonal interactions and self-concept. Her research also examines how racial, ethnic socialization experiences and racial identity are related to the process of identity development and the social and the academic experiences of Black children and youth. Dr. Adam Bass regularly trains youth development professionals and teachers to use culturally relevant practices when working with Black children and youth, and she is a faculty affiliate of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Dr. David Stovall. David Stovall, PhD, is a professor of Black Studies and Criminology, Law and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC. His scholarship investigates three areas. One, critical race theory. Two, the relationship between housing and education. And three, the intersection of race, place, and school. In the attempt to bring theory to action, he works with community organizations and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. His work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Lawndale Little Village School of Social Justice, otherwise known as SOJO, which opened in the fall of 2005. Furthering his work with communities, students, and teachers, his work manifests itself in the involvement with the People's Education Movement, a collective of classroom teachers, community members, students, and university professors in Chicago, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area who engage in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he has also served as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice from 2005 to 2018. Thank you all for joining us. Dr. Bryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graham, and thanks to Dean Jackson, the faculty and staff and student body in the School of Education for this invitation, and especially for this important conversation on racial violence against Black children in schools. Consistent with tonight's conversation, I would like to address racial violence in Black boyhood play. I would like to suggest that given my focus on Black boys, my work does not exclude the ways in which Black girls are racialized and gendered during play and face also racial violence during play. I like to start out with sharing a few stories that may be familiar to some people and unfamiliar to others. Imagine playing in a park with a toy gun, being adultified, and shot within moments of police officer arrival. This is the story of Tamir Rice. Imagine playing on your school's playground an innocent game of dodgeball, inadvertently hitting a white male and being suspended from school and charges being brought against you for assault. This is the story of Bryce Lindley. Imagine playing with a toy gun during remote learning and being suspended from school. This is the story of Isaiah Elliott. With these stories in mind, it is important to understand that when Black boys aren't physically murdered, like Tamir Rice, they are spiritually murdered, or they experience the psychological and physiological trauma associated with being Black in a white supremacist state. These stories also denote what it means to play and live in the afterlife of slavery. And Dr. Saidiya Hartman describes this notion of afterlife of slavery as this ongoing degradation of Black life by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. Why are Black boys victims of racial violence during play? We've read the literature. First and foremost, Black boyhood is misperceived. Oftentimes, Black boys are considered unchildlike, dangerous, and up to no good. And as such, these misnomers are mapped onto the ways in which they play. So their childhood play experiences are also described as dangerous, hypersexual, homophobic, etc. Teachers are also complicit, much like cops, in upholding the stereotypical biases of Black boyhood play. I would like to stop sharing my video for a brief moment to share with you a video which speaks a little bit more to the ways in which teachers are complicit in the racialized and gender violence Black boys face during play.
There's a new study out of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing. A Black boy, a Black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. Well, here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and Black alike, spent the most time watching the Black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. Researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a Black child, or even a Black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, imagine where else that's true.
So to interrupt this persistent racialized and gendered violence that Black boys face during play, I think it's important to foreground important theories that can help us better understand the racialized and gendered experiences of Black boys. So I would like to foreground Black critical theory and Black male studies. Black critical theory builds on critical race theory, which centers racism as a permanent structure in all American institutions, including schools. Whereas critical race theory centers racism as endemic, Black critical theory centers anti-Blackness, this particular disdain and hate for Black people as reflected in the laws and policies of the land. Dr. Lamar Johnson, Gloria Boutte, and I introduced what we called the 5 types of anti-Black violence that Black children, and particularly boys, face in schools. They include physical violence, this ongoing abuse and assault that stems from racial discrimination, and symbolic violence, this metaphorical representation of violence that stems from the suffering against the Black body. Linguistic violence, this is a form of violence that marginalizes and polices Black language and other languages that Black and brown children bring into schooling spaces. Dr. April Baker Bell suggests that when teachers enact linguistic violence against Black children, they are engaging in anti-Black linguistic racism. Curricular and pedagogical violence deals with this infiltration of white supremacy ideologies and texts and materials that are used in school. Thus, pedagogies such as culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogies are marginalized in classrooms to give space for white-centric curricula. And then there's systemic school violence. This form of violence is deeply ingrained in the school structures, the policies and procedures. It determines who is overrepresented in gifted ed or underrepresented in gifted ed and overrepresented in special education. That means that Black children, boys in particular, are facing these 5 types of anti-Blackness on a daily basis in schools. So imagine 12 years of facing and experience anti-Black violence and how that can dehumanize Black boys and other children of color. Black male studies builds on Black critical theory. Black male study is introduced by Dr. Tommy Curry. And Dr. Tommy Curry suggests that whereas anti-Blackness in Black critical theory is centered as endemic to the Black people's experiences, Dr. Curry suggests that anti-Blackness, anti-Black misandry, this particular hate and disdain for Black men is endemic to American society. And anti-Black misandry, or Black male studies writ large, is grounded in social dominance theory. And what social dominance theory suggests is that outgroup men, marginalized men, including Black men, are seen and perceived as threat to intergroup men, or those who are part of the dominant culture, white in this case.
Dr. Bryan, this is your 2-minute mark.
Thank you. So collectively, drawing on Black critical theory and Black male studies, I introduced what I propose as Black play crit, which is a theoretical and pedagogical framework that explains the anti-Black misandric violence that Black boys face during play. And Black play crit includes 3 important developing ideas. And the first idea is this idea of play not. Is endemic to the play experiences of Black boys. The second one is the play past, play present, and future nexus. And lastly, the public pedagogy or philosophy of Black boyhood play. Play not is this idea that Black boys are stereotypically considered undeserving of play because of the ways in which their bodies are read. The idea of play past and play present and future makes connection between the history of Black children's play in America. We know that during enslavement, Black children were not given or afforded the right to play. They were oftentimes playing with white children to learn English to take back to their parents so their parents could work towards freedom. So in my work, I argue that whereas white children were playing freely, Black children were playing towards freedom. And lastly, the public pedagogy of play is this theoretical or pedagogical tools that teachers can use to help Black boys reshape the way they think about their own play experiences and to see play as a tool towards social justice. All in all, Black play crit helps us to acknowledge the racialized and gendered experiences of Black boys in and beyond schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan. Next, we'll have Dr. Adams Bass.
Okay. Well, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Thank you for joining us. Again, I'm happy to be here and share with you. I'm going to start out by in reverse. I'm going to share a video, then I'm going to talk through a few slides. So give me a moment to queue up my video so that you will be able to take a look at that. A few seconds. I am using YouTube, so I hope that this works well.
Think you're gonna get into Harvard? I'm from a poor, crime-filled neighborhood, raised by a single mother, don't know my dad, blah, blah. Cliche.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Malcolm Adekanbi. I'm a straight A student with nearly perfect SAT scores.
He probably got like one of those photogenic brains.
You mean photographic memory?
What did I just say?
I mean, yeah, you said it. You have to keep reiterating. I play in a punk band with my friends, and I'm a 90s hip-hop geek.
You gonna say something or just stare at me?
A bad day for most geeks would be being the butt of jokes.
Some brother really needs to invent an app like Waze to avoid all these hood traps.
It is time we started expanding our horizons.
We're not going to a drug dealer's birthday party. But when you live in the bottoms,
Well, I'll go if you go.
a bad day could look like this. We were dancing, man.
If I let this slide, we got what they call a slippery slope. You know what a slippery slope is? Do it got anything to do with skiing? Shut your ass down. Don't make fly. Do you have what I left in the backpack?
Did he actually say I'll kill you and your friends if you don't get rid of these drugs, or just you? Don't act like you weren't curious too.
Hey, all we gotta do is find the white people, go to Coachella, Lollapalooza.
We don't know nothing about drugs.
You do.
We need to know if you're gonna help us. Okay.
Nobody's gonna suspect a thing. We're just geeks doing what geeks do.
I don't want to go to jail. I want to go to college.
Ah, slippery slope.
Exactly.
You play with me, my little boy from the hood?
Hey, wait. I am the authority in keeping a proper brother to Horatio. So unless you got some boobies, what? Like boys don't cry. Remember we were saying that? Remember that.
Allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Malcolm Adekanbi. Can you dig it?
You can call me N-word, and I can't say it.
Technically, you shouldn't be able to say the word. Why can you?
Okay, because I'm 14% African. Ancestry.com.
Look, just say the damn word. You're my... Where's the reflex?
So I just want to, give me 1 second, give me a minute. As I've said, and in this webinar, I'm going to become a DJ using all these buttons. So again, thank you for joining us today. And my research really focuses on African-American young adults and adolescents, really just getting an idea of what can we do to equip them with the skills, and the young people to equip them with the skills, and to equip the teachers and educators and family members who work with them. I really looked at media images, and I wanted to start off with dope to contextualize the remainder of my few moments with you, and say that what you see sometimes is what you get and what people respond to. I typically investigate how Black adolescents respond to negative media stereotypes about them, usually in fictionalized media such as dope and other movies, although we know that social media is increasingly becoming a platform where racialized experiences are also occurring. Why is this important? What does that have to do with this conversation? If you're a teacher, or if the teachers of Black students, particularly Black boys, have only encountered Black young men, Black children, Black preschoolers, as was mentioned by Dr. Bryan, in media content, most of that content is stereotypically negative. And that's the perception from which that they are going to engage with Black children and Black boys. So why I like dope and use it as an exemplar is this idea that Blackness is not, there's not one definition of Blackness. And in my studies, we take a look at Blackness as a commodified version of what it means to be Black. And often in these media spaces, what it means for Black boys is that they're uneducated or undereducated, as was seen even in the script, the mispronunciation, the misunderstanding, involved in violence, involved in drug trafficking. And then if that is the only space that the teachers, the 75% of the white women who are teachers of Black boys and Black girls, are encountering and engaging. They're not living in the same neighborhood. They're not necessarily shopping in the same places. If that's the only encounter they have, then that's the perception that goes into the classroom and influences the context in which we assume that Black boys or Black girls even are not interested in learning. We assume that they're going to be violent or be ready to engage in some kind of relationship or disagreement that disconnects them from their learning experience. Where do these negative stereotypes come from? Great question. I'm so glad that you asked me that question. So I want to share a few slides with you associated with where these negative media stereotypes come from. And for some of you, you may be aware of this. For some of you, may not be. But really, this dehumanization of the Black body, and particularly the Black male body, really is an extension of slavery, right? This idea of the transatlantic Holocaust, this idea that slavery and the laws that were put in place, the legislation was put in place, was really to dehumanize and take advantage of the Black body. So these current contemporary stereotypes of Black boys and Black girls that we see in media spaces, even some of those images that Black boys and Black girls begin to adopt and accept themselves, really are on this continuum of how Black bodies were dehumanized through the process of slavery. And oftentimes in our contemporary media spaces, we forget that, particularly if we haven't been educated on Black history knowledge or the experiences of enslaved Africans coming to this country. And that goes for both those who are teaching Black boys and girls, as well as the Black boys and girls themselves who may not have this historical legacy and knowledge. Why is this important? There's this commodification of Blackness, and in some cases, in most cases, it's used to make money, right? And so this idea of making money and using the experiences, both those that are positive and those that are negative, and come along with some form of trauma, are used to make money. So in this example, we have this Gucci sweater that was just out maybe 2.5 years ago, high-end pret-a-porter company, where there was an apology, an association, and there's a clear association for some, but for others, there was an apology and an assumption that they did not know. So this goes back to this idea of the need for education around the experiences of Black people in America, and how contemporary images really influence teachers' perspectives of the body, the physical body, as well as the corporal body, the entire group of Black boys and Black girls when they're in these educational spaces, and the negative assumptions that come along with that. So
Dr.
really
Adams-Bass, this is your 2-minute mark.
Thank you. So thinking about that, and I will end with this, and I'm happy to have more discussion because 10 minutes is 10 minutes. Is this Black experience, right? So this Black experience is often commodified and used when it's convenient, as was seen in the clip of Dope and the discussion of the N-word. When it's convenient and considered favorable, then Black boys and Black girls are viewed favorably. When it's not convenient, then it's more and much easier for people to pull in those negative stereotypes and use those to interpret the behavior and make assumptions that can impact how those boys are tracked into advanced placement courses or special education courses, whether or not they are tracked into a school for remedial school. And so it's important for us to think about the images and the perceptions that come along those images and what they mean, not just to the young people, but to the adults, those teachers in classrooms and those administrators, those principals, and those SRO officers who are engaging with these Black boys based on what they've seen on a televised image versus an actual relationship with those boys or their families. So I'm going to stop there, but I look forward to more discussion and sharing more about why this is salient, particularly in this time of living digitally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adams-Bass. Next, we'll have Dr. David Stovall.
Well, peace and greetings, everybody. Greetings from the land of the Council of Three Fires, also known as Chicago. I also want to say peace to the folks who are surviving, as we all are, under the three pandemics of COVID, white supremacy, and capitalism. And I think it's important to put that forward as we move in our work. And I want to thank Dr. Bryan and Dr. Adams-Bass in terms of providing a necessary framework. So I'm going to borrow from some of their own scholarship and then kind of put it in the framework of thinking about what does this mean in real time. So if we look at the scholar Michael Dumas, he reminds us that schooling is often a site of Black suffering. So if we understand that schooling is this site of Black suffering, meaning that it is not a place where Black children are intended to grow and learn, but a space where they are instead expected to suffer through punishment, then what are the questions that are we willing to consider if we understand this to be true? Now, for many of the teachers and administrators who are on the call right now, when I say this, people often think about that as an accusal. It's not an accusal as much as it is understanding a structural phenomenon. And when I say this structural phenomenon, and as both folks before me talked about this afterlife of slavery, now we have to think about, well, if slavery was only ended except for punishment for a crime, as it states in the 13th Amendment, then what is the expectation on a body that is in these spaces that has been structured in many ways to show them how much it hates them? If you are disappeared in curriculum, if you are not acknowledged in any practice in that place, then why would you be expected to accept it? So now if we think about this in real time, I want us to, again, go back to this. So what does this mean tomorrow, right? You know, you all have sat through a webinar, you've heard people talk about the ways in which this manifests itself and the ways in which we get fooled into believing certain things about Black people. So what does this mean in real time tomorrow? When you go back to your digital spots and are engaging with young folks and families, and dare we push ourselves to think about something like abolition, right? The literal ending of the practices and processes that dehumanize, marginalize, and isolate Black children in schools. So don't think about this as some wild socialist conspiracy. It's not there yet. It's really this understanding that abolition says that there is something that is happening that is wronging people, and that thing needs to be ended. And if we work to end that, what does it look like in our day-to-day practices? And Bettina Love talks about an abolitionist teaching. Sadia Hartman talks about fugitivity. Stephen O'Harney and Fred Moten talk about fugitive learning or fugitive planning. And when you think about fugitivity, I'll go back to a conversation that I actually had with Michael Dumas. And he said, look, fugitivity is a decision to run. You are not running from something. You are running to something. You have to figure out with the people that you are running with where you are running to, because the thing that you are in is unacceptable. So very briefly, I want us to entertain some things that we can actually do tomorrow in terms of thinking about what does a practice of abolition look like in a place that is intended first to punish Black bodies in opposed to uplifting them. And some of these things may sound controversial, but some of these things are actually happening in districts as we speak. And a lot of times people feel hamstrung by the current COVID moment where we are locked away from each other in these kind of virtual spaces. But I think we have to entertain this. And I'm going to ask the administrators in K-12 institutions to be a little brave here, because there's a moment where you have to step up and actually call these things what they are and really be about the business of saying, I will no longer punish Black students for who they are in the world. I have made a commitment to uplift them because the expectation on their bodies is one of criminality before humanity. Right? So if we operate from that premise, what are those things that we can do tomorrow? Number one, standardized testing needs to go. There is no plausible reason for a form of assessment that is based in eugenics to be used as the pallbearer for academic achievement. Now, however controversial that sounds, we need to think about this in a particular way, because what we've actually seen in this COVID moment is colleges and universities actually saying, you know what? These tests don't really tell us anything formatively or substantively. So now we won't even use them as in admissions requirements. So now, if these high-end universities like the University of California system are no longer using them in admissions requirements, why are we still using them as the form to demonstrate learning at the K-12 level? They need to go. And the assessments that need to be developed, because I know the next question is, well, what are we going to do? The assessments that need to be developed locally. And they need to be based in skill development. So now, what skills are you trying to create? And now, how do we, what practices do we use to develop those skills, right? Second thing, grading. I know I'm getting funky here, y'all. That needs to go too, because these are just arbitrary, these are arbitrary numbers that's scripted to a particular set of views and values around standards that literally have nothing to do with academic performance. So now what does it mean to say? And so we have schools across the country that have actually very high-end, wealthy private schools that don't use grading systems, right? They talk about a young person having mastery or proficiency or not being there yet, right? So these literally are forms of assessment. And if a young person is at that category of not yet, then the responsibility of the school community is to get them to the space that they need to be, right? So now if we think about that in particular ways, why are we even using these particular systems? Now, again, I know I'm embracing a radical imaginary here, but I am not telling you things that do not already exist, right? So it's not coming,
Dr. Stovall.
Yep, it's not coming from out of the sky. So now if we're getting rid of testing, we're getting rid of grades. And the last point, let us get rid of this terminology from our vocabulary. I cannot wait to get back to normal. Look, y'all, normal has been the problem. Normal has been the expectation on the criminality of Black children before their humanity. So now, instead of getting back to normal, what does it mean to get to someplace else? And let me be clear, reform is not enough. You cannot reform what was never intended to work. So now when we think about our work in a particular way, we need to entertain what these processes are, and there are some things right in front of our face that we can do. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stovall. Dr. Hines, the floor is yours. I'll give you a 2-minute mark as we previously agreed.
And so I'll be presenting today on Black girls and anti-Blackness in schools. And so one of the things I want to start with is this image. And so I have an image of a little Black girl, she's 6 years old, named Ruby Bridges. In 1960, during the Civil Rights Movement, Ruby Bridges was the first Black student to be integrated into a school. And one of the things that she faced was this challenge of, how do I, as a Black girl, fit into this predominantly white space that doesn't want me there? And so as she marched into this elementary school, William Frantz Elementary School, she was surrounded by 4 U.S. Marshals. But one of the things that stood out to me and why I wanted to start with this picture is because it's a painting. And so this painting was painted by Norman Rockwell in 1964, about 4 years after Ruby Bridges integrated this all-white elementary school. And the title of this painting is really what stood out to me. And so that's actually the title of my presentation. The title of this painting is The Problem We All Live With. And so I'll be presenting very briefly on this topic, the problem we all live with, anti-Black aggressions, and the impossibility of Black girlhood. We know from a lot of research that racism and anti-Blackness are two different things. And so what Black girls face in schools has everything to do with their hypercriminalization, but also this idea that they live in this inhumane status. And so when we look at the research, it tells us that Black girls are more likely to be disciplined, they're more likely to be disregarded, and have a higher probability of criminalization in schools. So it's not just the discipline part, it's also the schooling space that Black girls continuously have to navigate and they have to make sense of on a daily basis. And so those schooling spaces are those remedial classes that they're placed in. Those schooling spaces are a matter of whether or not they'll be placed into gifted education classes. And even if they're in gifted education classes, there's an issue about diversity. So are Black girls' narratives and histories even being represented even within these advanced and gifted education classrooms? And so we know that all the way around, Black girls experience criminalization as young girls, but they also experience this level of non-feminization. And so what does it mean to be a Black girl, but to not be seen as being feminine? What does it mean to be a Black girl when I say feminine, not being seen as feminine? I'm really talking about seeing as aggressive, seeing as someone who is intimidating just by walking into the classroom, just by walking down the hallway. And so research does show us, a lot of scholars, that Black girls are often criminalized and seen as non-feminine based on different things. So one are their natural hair and braids. And so Black girls are more likely to be penalized for wearing natural hair, afros, even natural hair as I have now, but even wearing box braids and twists. And so things in their hair that are more of a cultural nuance that we see amongst the Black community, it's often something that schools see as a form and way to criminalize Black girls. Secondly, the dress code. And so looking at the differences in terms of what Black girls are able to wear, but then even how their bodies are being policed for what they wear, for how they are naturally shaped. And then lastly is this concept that I really push, is that Black girls are often guilty until proven guilty. And so there is often a lack of due process. There is often a believability of their side of the story. And so what that paints a picture of is not just of what Ruby Bridges experienced, that level of criminalization and inhumanity, but we see even today, even 60 years later, Black girls are still fighting for a right to even exist in schools. And so we have this, what I call is this paradox of Black girlhood, but then also Black girl childhood. And so there's different characterizations in the literature that we find about Black girls. First, Dr. Venus Evans Winters tells us from her research that Black girls' bodies are often viewed by adults as being dangerous bodies. And so there's just this level of intimidation that exists, perceived intimidation, just from Black girls' bodies existing within spaces in schools. Also from Fordham's earlier work, we know that there's this idea that we have these loud Black girls, right? So these are Black girls that they won't be quiet. They always have something to say. But then also we find that research shows us that Black girls are often adultified. And so even as young as, 6, 7, 8 years old, even into 10 and 11 years old, Black girls are often seen as grown women and adults. And so there's this different level, this paradox of Black girlhood and Black childhood that Black girls often have to navigate. And this is against, right, these concepts that we have about what femininity looks like. And so the characterizations of femininity are really based oftentimes on white femininity and white girlhood. So these are these ideas that, femininity represents sugar and spice and everything nice. Bernstein in their work shows that, femininity is often, and innocence is raced white. And so there's a lack of innocence that is given to Black girls and Black girl childhood. There's a lack of believability that what they're saying is actually truthful and is actually a valuable experience. But then lastly, there's this idea that comes often with femininity, that there's this presumed humanity. And that presumed humanity is often, again, that's not what's afforded to Black girls, but also to Black girl childhood. So with this paradox we see about what Black girls experience versus what other girls experience, I created this idea with a graduate student of mine at the University of Kansas, looking at anti-Black aggressions. And so I argue that if we want to think about in more nuanced ways how Black girls do exhibit brilliance, how Black girls should be valued in the classroom, how Black girls do bring humanity with them, we have to look at it not just in terms of race and racism, but also in terms of anti-Blackness. And so some of the research literature created by Solarzano and Yasso describe this term called, there's this aggressions, right? And if you look at some of the work of Sue, who invented this term, created this term, racial microaggressions, we know that there's different aggressions. So there's different levels of racial violence that can perpetuate against people of color. And so a lot of the work with Solarzano and Yasso draw from critical race theory. They also have a model in which they draw from racial microaggressions in their earlier work in the 2000s. And so I drew from Solarzano and Yasso's work, as well as work from Sue, and created this concept of anti-Black aggressions. And so how do racial microaggressions manifest themselves against Black girls using a lens of anti-Blackness and not just race and racism? And so this figure that I have here outlines 3 levels of aggressions. First being anti-Black microaggressions. Secondly, being anti-Black institutionalized racism. And then thirdly, anti-Black macroaggressions. I argue in my work, it was published in Multicultural Education Journal through NAME, the National Association of Multicultural Educators. I argue that first, anti-Black microaggressions can be understood by looking at the racialized and gendered experiences of Black girls at the micro level of schooling. So these are those subtle insults. These are those inhumane learning and really unlearning experiences that Black girls experience in the classroom. And so what this looks like is, you're pretty smart for a Black girl. What this looks like is that constant criminalization and seeing Black girls through this lens of dehumanity and demonization rather than their brilliance. And again, that value that they actually just naturally bring with them to the classroom. Next, we have the term anti-Black institutionalized racism. So these are those systemic policies, but also those practices that educators often use within the classroom. And so the prime example that I have seen, and there's many, is the curriculum. And so how are we showing Black girls in the curriculum? And oftentimes as educators, when we don't include them in the curriculum, no works written by Black women, Black girls, there's no images of them in positive ways, we're actually institutionalizing anti-Blackness through what we teach. It's through our pedagogy, it's through our pedagogical stance, it's through the silencing of Black girls, not just in the curriculum, but also in the policies that we use to talk to them, in the policies that we use to silence them, and in many ways act like they do not exist. And then lastly is this term anti-Black macroaggressions. And so I argue that these are the additive effects of the micro and then also the institutionalization of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. It becomes this normalized thing. It becomes the air we breathe. And so we're not going to contest something that we think is just appropriate and natural to do. And so this idea of anti-Black aggressions can really help us to understand not just Black girls in terms of their racialized and gender experiences, but also the ways that anti-Blackness has historically, but also in the present day, really negatively shaped the experiences of Black girls in schools. So what does this look like in terms of teacher education? One of the things that I want to point out really is the role that early childhood education plays in teacher education programs. You know, the number of kids who have the opportunity to actually go to Head Start, to actually go to early childhood programs, including daycares, we have to start doing research and really thinking about how are those educators being evaluated or not? Are there certain things that we're missing earlier on that is really putting Black girls, the babies, the young Black girl toddlers on the wrong path before they even enter into the K through 12 public school system? And so that's one of the things I think as teacher educators, and then just as teacher education programs, we have to think about the education starts in the earlier years as well, but then how we're preparing teachers or not to really help Black girls be successful long-term. And so I really like this question, and this is just my last slide to end, where Ruth Nicole Brown asks, what is necessary to imagine Black girlhood as a space of freedom? And so we can't just focus on looking at the classroom space as a free space, but how do we see Black girls and all that they embody within themselves as spaces and bodies of freedom as well? And so one thing I think to do that, we have to address these subtle slights and misconceptions about who Black girls are, how they can learn, because they can and they do learn, their bodies, but then also their positionality as learners and earners in the classroom. And so they're not just bodies sitting at desks, right? Black girls are girls who have earned their space to be in that classroom. And so we have to, as educators, pre-service and in-service teachers and educators, understand that Black girls have historically fought not just Ruby Bridges, but even before then, for a place to be in schools, and they deserve equitable treatment and equitable schooling in the classroom. And so we have to do that critical self-reflection, right? We have to look at ourselves and say, do I have the critical consciousness to not just educate Black girls, but to check my own self about my own stereotypes and misbeliefs and conceptions about who they are, how they learn, and what they have earned to even be in this classroom to begin with. Secondly, I think teacher educators really have to rethink school policies and practices and look at ways that those policies currently foster the maladaptive treatment of Black girlhood. And so what does that mean? That means that we have to go through the processes that we normally follow and do some checks and balances and look at where have we dropped the ball. Is it the policy or is it our interpretation thereof? And so what are the ways that we create maladaptive treatments or the improper treatment of Black girls and Black girlhood and Black girl childhood by just the way that we just do things, the way that we don't want to change things, and the way that we just want to keep the status quo. Also with this point, I think when we look at our school policies and practices, we have to address the spirit murdering of Black children. And so Patricia Williams' earlier work in the 1980s, as well as some of my work, draws from this notion of spirit murder. So we're not just killing Black girls' hopes and dreams, but what does it mean to damage someone's spirit? You know, what does that mean when a young Black girl is so happy and excited about school, but by what we do, it makes them not want to be there no more? How can schools be this great equalizer, right, of education, but then at the same time, its spirit murders you and damages you? And so those are the type of things that as in-service and pre-service educators, we have to really think about as we're preparing teachers in the classroom, as well as in universities and in higher education. And then my last point, I think it's important understanding Black girls, Black girlhood, Black girl childhood, and anti-Black aggressions is really seeing teacher education, as some of the work cited here, as a form and a way to love Blackness to death, right? That's a slang that you kind of hear and say in the Black community, like, oh, I love that to death. Like, that's something that, you know, I can identify with you. But I would also challenge that notion and ask, how can we love Black girls and Blackness to life, right? Again, how can we see the humanity of them and serve them in such a way that we don't just love them to death, but we do learn them to love them to life, and we mean it. So I do hope at some point teacher education will work in collaboration with Black girls, their parents, guardians, and communities to really love them to life, to really rethink teacher education so that anti-Black aggressions, Black girls will no longer be this idea, and just to end, it will no longer be this problem that we all live with. Thank you very much.
Let me pose the first of a few questions to our group of panelists who've done such a marvelous job tonight informing us and educating us. The first question, I want to explore this fact of violence against Black children in schools a bit more. The term violence is a heavy term. I don't want to assume that everyone in our audience understands what is meant by this term of violence. I would love to hear how and or why is the knowledge, the lived experiences, the research you all have presented so eloquently tonight, how does that indeed represent forms of racialized violence against Black children in schools, as opposed to singularly representing intersectionality or microaggressions or so on? What is the turning point that makes something a form of violence as we think about contextualizing the schooling experiences of Black children?
Well, I think we can all answer that. So I'll just take a slice of that. What I want to share in terms of thinking about violence, there's emotional violence as well as physical violence, right? And there's also that cognitive violence. So there's that processing that Black children have to do when they're absent from a curriculum, or teachers and administrators make assumptions about their capacity. So I think I want to enforce, and I'm sure others will share with our audience tonight, that the violence is not always physical. It's not just physical. And you'll hear people say, sticks and stones, names will never hurt me, or whatever the newest version is, or razor remarks. But those remarks do hurt. And there is a processing that Black youth and children need to go through to protect their self-concept when they are consistently and persistently alienated in the classrooms in which they're sitting, where they are absent from the curriculum, where the pictures and images that are presented and shared are always from a deficit model. Oftentimes, that is not the only experience they have, regardless of where they live in this country. Everything about being Black is not negative. Everything about living in an urban community is not negative. We're seeing that through COVID-19. But if that's the perception that they have to navigate, then it over and over, it certainly becomes a form of violence that they have to protect themselves from.
I honestly like to think of violence as being too weak of a term to describe what's actually going on. It's really about Black death, right? It's Black social, political, educational death. So I see schools as as graveyards, right? Always preparing room for Black bodies, because not only are schools spiritually murdering Black children, they're physically murdering Black children when they're not arming them with the essential tools to be able to navigate this white-centric, white supremacist society. So yeah, I think we really need to shift our vocabulary and really talk about what is actually going on by naming it, and it's Black death. Everything about America is death in terms of Black people. And our children are not safe or saved from that death.
And Dr. Graham, there are two things that I get from your question, and continuing on what Drs. Bryan and Adams Bass were saying. One thing is to think about the normalization of the exclusion of Black people, and to do that over long periods of time. That to me equates as violence, right? It's no longer micro, right? It's no longer an intersectional play in terms of understanding the ways in which power and privilege merge, right? It's deeper than that, right? It's more in perpetuity, and that perpetuity makes it violent. And now when we think about violence in this particular way, it allows us to understand what a land, and the second part is, if we live in a land that is founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation, then what is the expectation of a place that is supposed to perpetuate the views and values of the broader society, if we consider those places to be school, right? So I think about that in particular ways. When we think about the United States is a land that is politically and socially founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation. And the schools are encased with the values and responsibilities of communicating, quote unquote, the founding of this place, right? So therein lie how we understand this to be a violent relationship, because the land itself is formulated and founded in violence.
Yeah, I just want to pop in. I know, Dr. Graham, you may have another question. I want to address, I think Hacinda, if I'm pronouncing that right, guys, had a comment here and sort of saying that she was a little offended by the idea of disregarding or discarding standardized test scores. And I would agree with you that many Black children do well on standardized test scores, but I also want to push you on the fact that standardized test scores, one, as Dr. Stovall said, were not meant for Black children or brown children, but two, that there's a cultural bias. There's an inherent cultural bias. And if you speak to any of those who create tests, or psychologists, particularly Black psychologists who've been trained from a Black psychological perspective, they can give you many examples of how the standardized tests questions are biased, as well as some of the tests that are used to track accept students into special ed or not. I'll use a tongue-in-cheek example. I have a friend who's a clinical psychologist, and as she was assessing a young man, the question was, what is a fade? That was the question. What is a fade? This is a question that was on it, scored. He was to be scored on. The little boy said, it's a haircut. Now, someone without the cultural, she was supposed to score him as 0, as not knowing the answer. But as someone who had the cultural context, she gave him points for it. So I don't want to say that, it's a legitimate point to disregard or throw out those test scores until they are more reflected and representative of the young people who are taking them. And if you're going to keep them, then there needs to be that cultural context that we are pushing for. This absence, this silencing of the experiences is very true and legitimate. And this moment of reckoning, there are many around the world who are saying, is there a science to this? And this panel, as well as many other scholars that we could quote today, have been doing the science and in some ways also have been silenced from these policymaking spaces where we can push the envelope and say, why does your curriculum look like this? Why is this standardized test score like this? Or here are some suggestions for improvements or an alternative that can benefit all students and not just a selective group. I just wanted to address that because I did fairly good too, but I think that's an important point to push on, even if you do well.
Thank you, Dr. Adams-Bass, and sure, there's no problem with you addressing that. Let me move on to the next question, unless any of the panelists have any more remarks about that. So generally, violence, or even if we use Dr. Bryan's term, Black death, necessitates 3 types of actors at the very least, right? There are the perpetrators, there are those that are the violent, they are the violent ones. There are the victims, and then usually there are some observers, right? Moreover, racial violence against Black children in schools, we know that is an old and tiring plot. How can this script, the one where Black kids are subjugated, dehumanized, victimized in schools, how can this script begin to become rewritten in the context of what Dr. Stovall called America's 3 contemporary pandemics?
Yeah, I think one thing that come into place is really thinking about what the practice of unlearning means, and not just theoretically, right? But what does it mean to take into account what has been said about you in perpetuity? And now what does it mean to reclaim that what has been stolen from you, right? And I take this from a scholar, Patrick Kamignan on the West Coast, who talks about we need to think about our schooling system as one that dispossesses young people, right? It does not put into them as much as it takes away from them. So now if we think about these pandemics of COVID, white supremacy, and capitalism, now what does it mean to rethink our world? And how do we actually have projects of demonstration that show how we can reimagine this world and do something different, right? So if we think about here in Chicago, we have deep infection rates of COVID. It's now 1 in every 18 people in Chicago could essentially be affected with COVID. So if we think about this, what does mutual aid really mean? What does it mean to meet folks' needs in relationship to food delivery systems? What does it mean to meet folks' needs in terms of housing insecurity? What does it mean to engage folks in terms of healthcare? Now, as I say these 3 things, those were all tenets of the Black Panther Party, right? So this idea of political consciousness, health and wellness, and peace of mind, right? So this thing around really building these spaces, I think one of the ways to address these 3 pandemics is to rethink what has been taken and now what is the process of recouping that which has been lost for the purpose of actually meeting people's needs. And I think that's a premise from any type of liberation struggle that we see on the planet.
And Dr. Stovall, you basically said what I was going to say. I think that we need to acknowledge that we already have models in terms of what we need to do. When we think about what happened in segregated schooling, much of what took place was to build and uplift Black communities. So we really need to become more familiar with our own history and draw on that history to engage in this radical imagination or this rethinking of our current schooling structures.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, both what Dr. Bryan and Dr. Stovall have said. A few things I want to add. We do have models, and one model which was counter this integrated educational experience, as well as to counter the poorly resourced Black schools in the South, was the Freedom School. Right? Let's kick the elephant. Let's talk about that. During that civil rights movement, that was a community-based classroots movement to educate the parents and the children. It wasn't just teaching literacy and numeracy. They were reading books by Black authors that did not make the list, right? So there again is that silencing of the experience, as well as the representations, the myriad representations of Blackness that weren't commodified, that aren't commodified. So that is missing, right? There's also been, if you will, this economic base for public education and how money follows children into particular spaces, and how schools are benchmarked and money is earmarked when they're considered violent and when they're considered Title I, and what that has to do in associations with Black and brown kids, where we do have models, but those models are often independent of our public education system. But I will also say, when we have great public education schools, maybe one or two, when they do well, they pluck those principals and those administrators and those teachers right from that school, and everything goes, it's relationships. That's one thing that we haven't talked about here. And that is what Dr. Bryan was saying. When there was those segregated schools, one-room schoolhouses, we have to look historically, and that's something that we don't do as much in a microwave society that we live in today. So as much information as we have access to, there's a rush to deny, and even unfortunately by some Black scholars and Black parents, that legacy that's influencing the educational spaces where we're sending our kids. There was recently an article in the New York Times talking about how so many Black children, while we're in COVID and social distancing is particularly hard for Black and brown children, Black children and families who get together, we have fictive kinships, but they're doing better academically because they're not facing that racial violence. Even if they can't articulate it, they can focus on their schooling, their education, without have to worry about a teacher calling them out erroneously or making assumptions about their capacity to learn. And so what I would say is, hopefully, just as these webinars are intended, that those practitioners who are teaching our children, as well as those policymakers, are paying attention to that trend, right? As well as the trend of Black parents who are deciding to homeschool versus continuously countering those spaces where their children are being emotionally abused.
Dr. Adam Bass, I really appreciate that. And as a Black homeschool mom who's also an academic, I hear you and I'm right there. That brings me to this next question. So, in what ways does this idea of self-determination, the self-determination of Black children and families, where does that play into what we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, I feel I think it's the perfect antecedent, right? The antecedents to violence is self-determination, right? This idea of being able to speak for oneself and opposed to being spoken for by others, right? This idea of you determine where you are going. And that is both an individual and a collective determination. And I think the collective determination is the one that we struggle with the most, right? So this idea, and I really appreciate the earlier point around thinking about schools, and everybody uses a book by James D. Anderson called The Education of Blacks in the South. And it's a critically important book because what it talks about in that space is that before you had public education in the state of Mississippi, Black people built their own schools. And then there's a scholar named Christopher Spann who actually shows that when Black people built their own schools, there was a Black school that was burned in every county in Mississippi from 1865 to 1880, right? So let's think about what that means, right? Self-determination was viewed as such a threat that they would destroy the spaces that folks were using to determine where they were going and to speak for themselves, right? So now if we think about what does places of learnings, and I won't even call them schools, right? They could be different names. The places where Black youth learn, how does it support their self-determination? Being able to individually and collectively determine where it is that they're going to go, right? And I think this actually challenges a lot of the rhetoric that we think about self-care, right? So self-care is wrongly interpreted as indulgent, right? It's this thing around just you in a room having lavender on your back, where in a broader collective sense, it says, well, what does it mean for all of us to have lavender on our back? What does it mean for us to actually be in a space where we have all determined what will support our health and well-being? And I think that when we think about those spaces and where the spaces are, where Black children are able to self-determine and to do that at the individual level and the collective level, these are the spaces that we need to pay attention to. I'm right up the street from a place here in Chicago called the Freedom Home Academy. And the Freedom Home Academy was built by a group of Black homeschoolers who just collectivized and then created a space of learning, right? So this thing around now, they're creating that space of learning based on their seeing each other engage in acts of self-determination. And I think that is critical if we're talking about doing right by Black youth.
And I think, in addition to what Dr. Stovall shared, like these historical spaces have value. And because I'm going to sort of zoom out to the macro level a little bit and say, we're so enamored by youth and what's next, right? That's become sort of the global phenom with little regard or respect, should I say, for the historical legacy that is traditionally a part of an African-American and African tradition and other cultures, or Black tradition, if you will, a diasporic tradition. But there's a need to engage in that Sankofa principle and don't just look at the historical markers, but find out about those organizations, because sometimes those people are still around and can tell you how they're continuing to do it or how it got done. And it isn't that we don't pay taxes and we shouldn't demand better by our school system and our education system, but when we're not getting better, we can come up with alternatives. There are other groups who do that. And when they do that, there's not a penalty the way there's a penalty associated with Black parents who choose alternatives that are better for their children. Whether you're an educated Black parent or high income or low income, when you choose an alternative that's better for your child, there is an assumption and a penalty associated with that that's not applied to other groups who choose to preserve their home language, who choose to preserve their spiritual or religious identity as part of their educational experience. So let's stop apologizing for loving on our children, loving on our community, and keeping those standards high. And that's probably less academic, but practical when we're talking about saving our children's lives. And in this moment, I think what's exciting and hopefully, that someone has jumped on this data is documenting the improvements that Black children are having that will counter the conversations that they don't like to read, they can't do math, there's no interest in science, where they are doing all of those things. And from a media perspective, to counter what they're seeing, I don't necessarily say I'm a fan of TikTok, but they're in these other spaces, creating these virtual identities that allow them to express their creativity, as well as hone a set of skills that are going to help them that are going to become life skills in these digital spaces. And so that is the type of evidence that we can present in those spaces where we are doing a both and. We're saying do the best by our children, which may mean pulling them out of spaces, but it may also say we need to hold this country, these education departments and K through 12 as well as K through 16 who are training teachers accountable for doing a better job. And in this moment, we're getting that evidence that counters everything that has become a part of that achievement gap discourse, that discipline discourse, that special ed discourse. That is happening in this moment. And that's something that, you know, we're living day to day, minute to minute. We're struggling through this together. And there's nothing wrong with lavender, Dr. Stovall. But as we're struggling, we certainly need to be capturing this data.
Yeah, if I can add in, my daughter is actually 6 years old. She just turned 6 November 4th. And so I'm just like, you know, thank the Lord, we progressing. But what I have noticed with her is that, you know, we talk a lot about K through 12 education, but even in terms of early childhood preschool, my daughter has been to so many preschool daycares and they have kicked her out. Even at 3, 4, 5 years old, in which one schooling facility daycare said, we don't think your child can even learn. She needs special attention. You know, she wanders around the classroom. And I said, well, are you sure she's just not bored? Is it something that you're doing with your curriculum? Is it something that you're not doing that is interesting to her? And so now she's in a Montessori school and she's one of the leaders in the class. They talk about how advanced and gifted she actually is. And so it was a level of boredom that she experienced in that classroom. And so I think we have to, as you said, expand the conversation, right? To not just talk about K through 12, but we need to talk about the womb to 12th grade, the womb to higher education, because that's honestly where it starts. And there's a lot to be said about what is not happening in preschools. There's a lot to be said about what is happening in these Head Start programs. There's money there, but what is the quality of an education or not that young Black children are actually receiving? And so as someone who, you know, I don't care just about my child, I care about all Black children. My child was not going to accept this narrative that you were going to say about her. And I think there's a level of agency that's available when parents are able to, and guardians say, this is not what I will accept from you about what you said about my child. And sometimes school systems, daycares, the whole, you know, continuum doesn't allow our voices to always say that. And so I think it's important to think about early childhood education as well in this larger conversation about parents as well as Black children.
I totally agree with you there. I think what happens, particularly in early childhood spaces, we focus so much on developmentally appropriate practices, right? So when Black children aren't able to fit within these developmentally appropriate structures, it becomes problematic, right? They are seen as disciplinary problems. They are seen as not fitting within the structure of the school. Therefore, we really need to talk more about culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining practices in early childhood spaces. And although there's some literature and some work in that area, we really need more, because our children, much like you said, they're dying in the womb, but they're also dying in early childhood classrooms. They are anti-Black and anti-Black misandric spaces.
So I want to just jump in there. It's wonderful to have other parents on the panel. Shout out to the parents on the panel, especially during COVID.
Dr. Adams-Bass, before you do that, let me just say, after your remarks, we're going to then hear Dr. Hines' prepared remarks. Then we'll jump back into our Q&A.
Absolutely. So what I want to just say in response to what Dr. Hines and Dr. Bryan has shared is we have to educate our children ourselves. And that sounds simple. And again, the racial socialization, there's some research out that had demonstrated, a couple scholars did some home visits, and they found that the preschool and early childhood work, right? Margaret Okolie, who's at University of Georgia, did some studies. Those children who had images on their walls, Black art, Black history, Black knowledge, they did much better in those spaces where they're having these violent experiences. That's not an excuse. It just means that we have to do the work. And there is research that documented that. And those children were much better at navigating those social spaces as well as academic spaces in early childhood because of what they were seeing at home. Not just the conversations we have, but what's on our wall. What books are they getting? What dolls? What colors are you wearing? How are you wearing your hair? What's the conversation you have? What music are you playing? As early as you said, as in the womb, you know? And what does your child see? My daughter learned her ABCs right before she was 2. We did the regular A for Apple. When we switched her ABC cards to A for Africa, B for Barack Obama, she knew it. Hands down, she knew it. So then we could move right on to who is Barack Obama? You know, who is Ida B. Wells? So by the time she gets into or got moved into a formalized educational space, I really wanted her to be able to say A is not just for Apple and Africa is a continent. So we have to do that work, and then we have to model for those educators, because also the teacher training certification for preschool teachers is not even the same as what it is for K through 12. And we have a problem with K through 12 training. So in all those spaces, we have to show up, not just to say my child is not going to tolerate it, but here's some other things that you need to add to your toolkit. So for show and tell, I'm like, take the Ida B. Wells doll, take those ABC cards, not those ABC cards. Do those things. That's something that as parents we have to be responsible of. And for the educators who are listening, you have to do the work to go and find those alternate ABC cards. You have to do the work to find those posters that include Black scientists, mathematicians, teachers, lawyers, doctors, not just those who you call on during Black History Month. You have to do the work, because if the parents are bringing it to you, it exists.
I think another.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Brian, we'll just hold that just to give, okay.
That another issue too is we have to start thinking about who we have in early childhood spaces. Early child, and we know that the teacher education is overwhelmingly white, but in early childhood education, more than 95% of the teachers are white. And therefore, there are barriers to the recruitment and retention of Black and Brown teachers who know how to draw on the cultural capital and wealth of our students. So we have to do so much more in terms of recruiting and retaining Black and Brown teachers in early childhood spaces.
So there's been a lot of conversation about ECE, early childhood education, the importance of it. We have one attendee who has a random question. How do I struggle with my elementary students, particularly Black elementary students, who perhaps want to sleep in class? Maybe they've had a rough night at home. It feels like a constant struggle to know when to hold Black children to high standards and expectations, and then also, or when to consider the context of their lived experiences. They deserve the best educational practices, not wanting them to miss out on the lessons, but also trying to be aware of their situations in their home life. So for our panelists, what are your reactions to that? Educators struggling with meeting Black children where they are, if indeed they are in a place of maybe having some tumult, some issues at home in their home life that's impacting them in their schooling experience, and yet wanting to also find a way to hold them to high expectations.
Yeah, I just want to say a few things about that. I want to acknowledge that there are some teachers who do great work. They're very empathetic. They're trying to meet students where they are, but we also know there are plenty of teachers who don't. So let's acknowledge the teachers who are trying to get it done. I think the challenge is if they don't have administrators at their school who support their efforts to try to get it done and meet the children where they are. Having said that, I want to encourage you to work to establish a relationship with the parents. And I also want to sort of situate that suggestion in the context of parents have violent experiences with schools too, and assumptions about why they're not at the parent teacher meeting. I can even say that the parent teacher meeting the other day was during my class. There was no way I could make it, and I quote unquote know better. So I do think that there are going to be times when you're trying to establish relationships with that community or those parents where those parents initially are not responsive. But that doesn't mean give up. It means that you have to find a way to establish that you are there for their children, you sincerely mean it, and then what resources are available. Also, can you talk to your administrator? Can you come up with suggestions? Can you talk to the parents? Are there parents who are ready and ripe to have a conversation with the teacher who will give suggestions for what could work, or why their child is up late, or why they can't come? So those conversations with the family are really important. They don't happen as much anymore because, again, in many of the spaces where teachers are teaching, they're not living. And so they have no idea what's going on except for what they see where in the media. And the media is not reporting too many feel-good stories about the Black experience or what's going on in Black communities and any level of cohesiveness that is there to exist. So you've got to form relationships with that community, the houses of worship, the parents, the community. You've got to try to have those relationships. Please don't just call the house when the child is falling asleep. Can you call and say they did good? Can you just put a note in there? Because again, that again puts a parent on the defense when all of the conversations are communicating negative things. So you've got to try to establish a relationship. And I often say when we're doing racial socialization or disruptive work, you have got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. That's the reality. That's one of my favorite phrases. Get comfortable being uncomfortable if you want to do this work and you want to do it well for the benefit of the children that you're serving.
And I think there's also this automatic assumption that because a child is sleepy in class, that is related to something that's happening at home. It could very much be related to what's going on in the classroom. So that requires some self-reflection. What's happening in your classroom space that is causing the child to go to sleep? So that start with asking yourself, what's going on pedagogically and curricularly that may cause the child to experience these, have these experiences where he or she may feel sleepy. Self-reflection is a must.
And to Doc Bryan's point, any good teaching is self-development, right? So when we talk about what it means to engage young folks and families and to establish relationships with them, the critical moment has to be our self-reflection for the purpose of developing ourselves and developing our practice as teachers.
Thank you so much. We had a comment about the teacher preparation within Freedom Schools, Black teacher preparation, being prepared and trained to address internal biases, inherent biases amongst Black educators themselves. What are your thoughts about that and your reactions to that?
Can we just put it out in the street that we got to get rid of this term implicit bias, right? This is my issue with bias. Bias or biases are informed by something. They're not implicit, right? They're not this thing that just come happenstance. So now we have to ask the question, what informs our bias? What informs how we move in the world, right? Because there are people making a ton of money. I was about to curse. It's people making a ton of money who are doing these implicit bias trainings, and we have no discussion or conversation about white supremacy. It makes no sense, right? So now when we start to think about this, we need to ask that question, what informs our bias? And now are we willing to confront those things that inform our bias? So again, nothing implicit about it, but a bias that is informed by something. And now how do we think about that intra-racially, right, within Black folk, and interracially across racial groups? But I think that point is critical because all of this stuff is about giving people a pass. And everything we've talked about tonight is saying, look, no more passes can be given, right? We've given people enough passes. So now we have to commit to some hard work, right? And that's not going to come by giving folks a pass. Well, it was my implicit bias. No, it was literally how you understand something, and you got to look at what informs how you understand that thing that you're trying to address, right? And that, to me, I think, is one of the most critical components, especially in this age where implicit bias training is just shooting through the roof, right? But we got to check that and think about that in a different way.
And I would also say, in terms of the training and that bias, the bias is based on what we see socially. And there, even if we think about the gender biases, and I also want to say that in my class on media stereotypes and Black adolescent development, they're watching TV. I think initially the students were like, we're just going to watch TV and wax poetic about it. But then they're getting theories and they're getting the history. And one of the things I do have them do once they've started watching the TV is take the implicit bias test on race and then write about it in their journal, which only I see. But guess what? They are so uncomfortable, even the Black students, with telling the truth. They say, oh, I did the gender test. Oh, I did the toy test. I said, I didn't ask you to do the toy test. I asked you to do the race test, because they're uncomfortable with acknowledging they have that bias. I teach at a PWI. I teach at a predominantly white institution. You're in a space where you're othered, you're minoritized, and you are attempting to fit in or conform to what the norms are. So in many ways, that is going to create a bias, whether you like it or not. And it's definitely going to create a bias if you have a lack of Black history knowledge. And that's one thing that came out of one of our studies that's going to be published in the Journal of Negro Education. Those high school students and college students who had a higher Black history knowledge score, they had higher career aspirations. Why is that important? Because they're in these school spaces where they are othered or treated differently. And so whether they get the grades or test high on a standardized test or not, they have higher aspirations. So they're likely going to pursue what it is they want to do. So we cannot lose sight of our history. We cannot lose sight of the cultural constructs that colorism exists within the Black community, whether we want to admit it or not, right? That there's a particular physique about Black women that has recently been commodified that before we were alienated for or ostracized for. So the bias does exist within community, and it does need to be a part of the teacher training. I would even say of the Freedom School training, so that people know, even if they're saying one thing, they're aware of what's influencing their perspective. Right. And it can't stand alone. I'm going to agree with Dr. Stovall. That's not enough. It's not enough to have a mission statement. It's not enough to have a racial bias testing. Where is the meat and potatoes that's going to go along with that? That does not excuse the behavior. It means you have to unlearn it and you have to learn some other things, and you have to acknowledge that you have it. That's real, and it takes work. It takes a lot of work. I don't think any of us are saying that this work is easy, but we are saying that it's vital, and it's important for our Black children, our Black boys, and our Black girls to thrive, not just survive. We don't want that. We want them to thrive.
One last question. We're at our 4-minute mark, and I want to throw this last question out to our panelists before we close for the night. This one attendee says, as a junior in college studying agricultural education, how can I address professors who aren't educated properly on the progress of Black students in high school? There are often negative connotations associated with Black students progressing in agricultural content. And I would say agriculture and every other what would seem to be non-traditional professional pathways for Black people. So what are some of your suggestions for this particular attendee and all other attendees who want to advocate for Black people in spaces that are traditionally deemed as white spaces?
I think we have to call them out. No longer should we remain silent about this unless we're becoming complicit too in the maintenance of anti-Blackness. So call them out and be brave and unapologetic about calling them out. That's the only way that the professor can grow and learn about Black students?
Let me just say this, there's a power dynamic. So let's keep it real. Even those of us on the tenure track, we know there's a power dynamic even for students. So here are a couple of things you can do, call them out that may not be feel as direct. Write your comments in on the class evaluation. Put your comments in on the class evaluation that with suggestion examples. You can also bring in readings that are not on the syllabus or the task or assignments. Like, hey, did you know that we have agricultural schools, that we also have land grant institutions, that Black farmers were excluded from X, Y, and Z? So you can bring in the knowledge base into the classroom when a discussion is occurring. And I know that has to be uncomfortable, but you have to start developing your skills because you're going to need them if you're living in America. And two, those teaching evaluations, go ahead and put in suggestions, talk about it, what should be included, why you have questions about this, because as educators and scholars, we're asked to show the evidence. So for the areas of research that we specialize in, we're able to show that evidence, which is why we're able to give lists of resources for this webinar. That professor has to do the same.
Thank you so much. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Silva. You'll have the last comment.
And that's where I was going to go with it. So one of the questions that you can have for this prof is, what informs that statement, right? Just ask it, put the honest back on them, right? What informs that statement? Is this something that you have studied or looked at, or is this an opinion of what you've seen about Black people, right? And leave it there, right? Let them struggle with it, right? Because now white supremacy does not expect you to respond to it. It expects you to acquiesce to it. So now, once you put the honest back on them, watch them fumble with it a little bit, right? But I think that thing becomes important because this is about our capacity not only to protect ourselves, but to actually be prepared for the oncoming work around what it will mean to self-determine, especially in something like education.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tonight's discussion. It has been incredibly worthwhile to me. I hope that you also have experienced it in the same way. We hope that you've enjoyed the wealth of information shared tonight. At the close of this webinar, there will be a prompt to complete a survey. We would appreciate you pausing to complete the survey and take the opportunity to review the resources provided around this topic. Lastly, we hope that many of you can join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the post-discussion of this panel. This concludes the webinar. If someone asked whether or not this discussion will be posted, it indeed will be posted. It will be posted on the School of Education, IUPUI School of Education's YouTube channel, as well as the IUPUI School of Education's website. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you so very much for attending. Stay safe and have a good night.